It is fitting that the lectures on the Reformation in Great Britain are being released on the weekend of the coronation of King Charles III. On the continent, the main Reformation groups, the Lutherans and the Reformed churches, as opposed to the Anabaptists and other radical reformers, are known as being part of what is called the Magisterial Reformation, named after magistrate local city leaders. Because the Lutherans and the Reformed, the magisterial reformers, believed in sacralism, in the union to some extent of church and state. That church and state, the minister and the magistrate, should work hand in hand, even hand in glove. This was the case in city-states in Switzerland and principalities in Germany. And the Reformation in England and Scotland was also part of this magisterial reformation, this sacralist church opposing the radical Reformation and Anabaptism. But far more than on the continent, the Reformation in the British Isles, especially in England, could better be described as not just magisterial, but magisterial. That is a reformation hand in hand, hand in glove, not just with the local magistrate, but with his royal majesty or her royal majesty who sits upon the English throne. Whilst on the continent, the Roman Catholic kings of France and Spain violently suppressed Protestantism, and in the Holy Roman Empire, the emperor had a fine balancing act to try and hold Reformation states and Roman Catholic principalities together as one. In England, the whims and beliefs of the monarch on the throne, the majesty on the throne, would cause the rise and fall of many. Now, at the coronation service of Charles III, we are shown the ultimate results of the English Reformation. Firstly, we have this. Charles was asked, "Will you, to the utmost of your power, maintain the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel? Will you, to the utmost of your power, maintain in the United Kingdom the Protestant, Reformed religion established by law? Will you maintain and preserve inviolably the settlement of the Church of England, the doctrine, worship, discipline and government thereof, as by law established in England? And will you preserve unto bishops and clergy of England, and to the churches there committed to their charge, all such rights and privileges as by the law they do or shall appertain to them or any of them?" And the king replied, "All this I promise to do." This lays out very clearly how closely entwined the church and the state are, but also that the Church of England, of which the monarch is the supreme governor, is clearly a Protestant church. And not only Protestant, but specifically Reformed and not Lutheran. Not its own thing, but Reformed, like the churches of Geneva with Calvin, or Strasbourg with Butzer, and Zurich with Zwingli and Bullinger. In fact, before he can ascend to the throne, the king must solemnly declare and testify that he is, and I quote, "a faithful Protestant, and that I will, according to the true intent of the enactments which secure Protestant succession to the throne, uphold and maintain the said enactments." No other church of the Reformation has suffered so much revisionism and blatant rewriting of historical reality and identity as the Church of England. When looking at the English Reformation objectively and historically, what comes across very plainly is that the Church of England never was a via media, a middle path between Rome and Protestants. It was firmly and certainly a Protestant church, and a church which consciously understood itself and was understood on the continent as being a Reformed church and not a Lutheran one. Not something in between those two, although undoubtedly it was closer to Lutheranism than other Reformed churches, but was widely accepted across Europe as one of the Reformed churches. The presence of the Church of England at the Synod of Dort, which we will get to in a few weeks' time, is something that testifies to this fact. Now, there can be no doubt that among the Reformed churches, the Church of England stood out as the odd sibling, the weird cousin, the part of the family on the fringe. But why was that? It's because of how tied the Church of England was to the will and whims of the monarchs during the Reformation. Whilst the other Reformed churches were generally speaking created by ground-up movements where ministers led popular groups of people to rise up and elect their own kind of believers onto city councils as magistrates and the like. And then once they were in power, they worked hand in hand with the city council, with the secular authorities. And they had a vision for reforming their single city, like just Geneva and just Zurich, or just this principality around Wittenberg. In England, the Reformation was on a vastly different scale, and the vision of Cranmer was beyond the wildest dreams of the continental reformers. The Church of England was founded on the vision of transforming an entire nation, one of the most powerful nation states in Europe, into a Protestant Reformed religion following land. Not from the ground up, but from the top down, through the rule of governmental law and by the governance of bishops, ensuring the Reformation takes place in their own dioceses. Ultimately, that vision of a Protestant reformed land would largely come to pass, and through the rise of the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, and a century or more of unparalleled missionary work like nothing ever seen before, that Protestant reformed religion would spread from sunrise to sunrise across an empire and beyond, on which the sun never set. Today, Anglicanism, the inheritance of the Church of England, is the third largest religious denomination in the world. But the Reformation didn't begin with an empire spanning the globe. It didn't even begin with bishops. It began with a scholar and a linguist called William Tyndale, and a king who was very much at that time a Roman Catholic par excellence. Now, to set the scene, when we dealt with England last, it was session 53, with John Wycliffe, the morning star of the Reformation and early Bible translator. Wycliffe died in 1384, but the proto-Protestant movement that he began, the Lollards, continued well into the future. In the 1430s, people were still being prosecuted and killed for being Lollards. And by the 1530s, 100 years later, when the Reformation really is kicking off, there's still pockets of Lollards on record in London, in Lincoln, as well as in York and Salisbury and Buckinghamshire and Gloucestershire. All places where the existence of Lollardy likely smoothed the progress of the Reformation among the masses. But one key thing that came out of John Wycliffe and his followers translating the Bible into English was that English translations of the Bible were banned by law in 1409. Now, on the continent, wherever you were, Italy or Germany or France or Spain or Portugal, you could find, if you had the money, Bibles in your own language, not just in Latin. It wasn't illegal. It's just that they were rare and no one really cared for them. But in England, it was illegal to have a Bible in English. And that just wouldn't do as far as William Tyndale was concerned, whose Bible translation and how it closely relates to the later King James Version or Authorized Version we covered back in session 35. Now, Tyndale was born in 1494 in the Lollard-influenced area of Gloucestershire. Likely that's where some of his radical ideas came from. And he moved to do his studies at Oxford in 1506, during which time he became greatly disillusioned with the theological education of the clergy. He would lament that they have ordained that no man shall look on the scripture until he is modelled in heathen learning 8 or 9 years and armed with false principles with which he is clean shut out from the understanding of the scriptures. A great lover of the Bible, he would defy the Pope and seek to bring people back to the Bible, even saying to one prominent clergy person, "I defy the Pope and all his laws, and if God spares my life, before many years pass, I will help the boy who drives the plough to know more of the scriptures than you do." Knowing that translating the Bible into English in England would be illegal and a death sentence, he left for Europe in 1524 and made a beeline for Wittenberg and Martin Luther and the others. Translating the Bible began there, and pages of it would be smuggled into England, where it came to the attention of Cardinal Wolsey, who in 1529 ensured that Tyndale was condemned as a heretic. Tyndale would after that frequently move around different Protestant centres and cities in Europe and continue his translation work, largely unmolested, until he opposed quite publicly in a book King Henry VIII's annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and the king himself then turned his gaze upon Tyndale. With immense pressure, Tyndale was eventually betrayed by a friend, and in 1536 tried for heresy and burnt to death, crying out as his final words, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Little did Tyndale know that the Lord was already at work in the eyes of the king. Henry VIII was very much a monarch who believed he was an intellectual and took an active part in the church and discourse about doctrine and the like. In this way, he was very much like a medieval Constantine the Great, who convened and spoke at and argued at the Council of Nicaea, but whose actual faith and where he stood on matters is largely questioned. In 1521, Henry VIII was given by the Pope the title Defender of the Faith for a book he wrote defending the existence of 7 sacraments rather than just 2 sacraments as the reformers like Martin Luther were arguing. But Henry was also open to new ideas, especially when those ideas might benefit him. One teaching among the reformers, including an influential book he likely read by William Tyndale, and indeed a teaching that John Wycliffe himself 100 years before had strongly supported, was that the monarch of a land should be the head or governor of not only the state but the church, rather than the Pope in Rome or some other distant religious figure. Now, this idea that the monarch has complete authority over all matters ecclesiastical and temporal is known as Caesario-papism, from the word Caesar or emperor, and papism coming from pope, emperor, pope. And this was very much the kind of teaching and reality of the Byzantine Empire in practice, even though prominent saints like John Chrysostom and Athanasius opposed it. And after the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Orthodox Church would move its centre of influence to Russia, where the state authority over the church would be even stronger. But in the west of Europe, where the Pope had supreme authority, and there were no Roman emperors until the Pope created one out of thin air, and then battled with him for centuries to follow, it was only in the Reformation in England that these ideas of Caesario-papism would actually come to fruition. You see, Henry was not happy with his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a marriage which was to someone who had been married to his dead older brother. And when his older brother died, his father, Henry the VII, demanded that Henry VIII marry his older brother's wife. The problem was that this kind of marriage, marrying your brother's wife, is prohibited in the Bible in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. And so after being married for some time and having several miscarriages and the birth of Mary but no male heir, Henry began to reflect and say, is this state of affairs actually God's judgment against my marriage because it's unbiblical? And so he wanted an annulment, not a divorce. Henry never actually sought or got a divorce. Ironically, the only Protestant church in Europe which continued to have a blanket opposition in law to divorce was the Church of England. But he needed to persuade the Pope to annul the marriage, that is to mean that it was never a real marriage in the first place. And so to help persuade the Pope of the need for an annulment to stop God's judgment, Henry requests the help of a largely unknown figure at the time called Thomas Cranmer. Now, Cranmer was to be the central figure of Anglicanism and arguably one of the most influential of all the reformers, if not, in the grand scope of history, the most influential. Cranmer was born in 1489 and he went to study in Cambridge. In Cambridge he met his first wife and married her, Joan, but she died in childbirth shortly afterwards, and her death opened the door for his ordination sometime before 1520. Now, Cranmer was a stellar student who consumed knowledge like nobody else, and he was passionate about the church fathers. He was passionate about biblical scholarship. He admired Erasmus, the early humanist whose works in the original languages of the Bible paved the way for the Reformation. And Cranmer grew up with the idea of, rather than going to the Pope, well, why don't you go to the Bible? And so when he comes to Henry and Henry wants this annulment, Cranmer says, well, let's not go to the Pope first. Actually, let's get the opinions of the other leaders of major universities across the continent to strengthen our position that this is unbiblical. And Henry liked this idea. And so after various discourses, Cranmer is appointed as the resident ambassador to the Holy Roman Emperor, and he travels to Germany. Here, Cranmer sees firsthand the effects of the Reformation and Lutheranism, coming to see the power of the gospel truths, how they're rooted in scripture, how they're proclaimed freely among the people. Cranmer converts to the Reformation cause and even goes so far as to marry Marguerite, the niece of the chief reformer in the city of Nuremberg. Now, while most clerics in his day, it was very common, simply took up a mistress and maintained the image of clerical celibacy, Cranmer had the integrity to marry Marguerite properly. Though due to the King of England's strong opposition to clerical marriage, Cranmer had to have Marguerite smuggled back into England in a crate and hidden from public view. All that happened in 1532, and shortly after that, Cranmer, when he was in Italy following around the Holy Roman Emperor, received a letter telling him to come back, because Henry the VIII had just appointed him to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. A minor unknown churchman had just been appointed to the most powerful bishopric in the realm. Why? Because Anne Boleyn's family, the lady Henry wanted to marry, they wanted Cranmer. They were reformer-minded. God works in mysterious ways. 4 years later, Tyndale would cry out from the flames that God would open Henry's eyes. God had already orchestrated that a Protestant, and a married one at that, had become Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, due to Henry already getting Anne Boleyn pregnant, he secretly married her in 1533 without Thomas Cranmer's knowledge, which rather forced matters with the annulment. Cranmer declares his marriage to Catherine unbiblical and annuls it himself and validates the marriage to Anne Boleyn before crowning her as queen. The Pope was, to put it mildly, furious, and he has Henry and Cranmer ultimately excommunicated from the church. Now, Anne would give birth to Elizabeth, and Cranmer would continue to quietly put like-minded reformers into important church positions as bishops, two key ones being Hugh Latimer and eventually Nicholas Ridley. Now, his support, within reason so as not to breach the peace of reformers and interceding for them when they got into issues with their more conservative-minded bishops, made Cranmer many enemies among the traditionalist bishops loyal to the Pope. And this would only worsen when Cranmer, working with the very Protestant Thomas Cromwell, orchestrated the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which declared that the monarch was, and I quote, the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England, called Anglicana Ecclesia. If you ever wondered where the term Anglican comes from, that's the first time it's ever mentioned here in the early days of the Reformation. Now, it was actually Thomas Cromwell who took the driving seat at this point in spiritual matters in the realm, and not the Archbishop of Canterbury, even though Thomas Cromwell wasn't even ordained. But this suited Cranmer, who was never much of a lover of public performance and conflict. In fact, Cranmer was well noted even by most of his opponents as being incredibly gentle of heart, disliking conflict and being more willing than is humanly reasonable to completely forgive those who wronged him. But what Cranmer was exceptional at was being a scholar and a visionary, with, during this period, unparalleled gifts for writing beautiful words. Now, after Anne Boleyn miscarried a son, the king again began to reflect, and he began to fear that he was being cursed again, this time for wrongly marrying Anne before a marriage to Catherine was annulled. But Catherine had died, likely of heart cancer. And at this point, that meant if Anne Boleyn could somehow be removed from the equation, Henry could marry freely and get out of this curse. Now, after a musician in Anne's service confessed, perhaps after torture, it must be said, to her having had an affair, Anne was arrested and executed for high treason. Henry then married Jane Seymour, who he'd already been courting for some time and who had had a very fractious relationship with Anne Boleyn. Cranmer was not happy about any of this state of affairs, excuse the pun, but he did as the king asked. His eyes were set on a higher goal and a longer term prize. As things progressed, Cranmer got to work on his national reform, starting with the 10 Articles of 1536, which were based on the Wittenberg Articles of the Lutherans, but were actually only very mildly Protestant. Henry, though, gets his male heir from Jane Seymour in the form of Edward, and his strongly held theological views would put the brakes on the Reformation. Though Cranmer in this period becomes ever more strident in his support for Protestant and actually more increasingly explicitly Reformed ideas rather than just Lutheran. And to the surprise of many, the very quiet Cranmer actually gives in extensive writing very robust rebuttals and defence against the king's own books. Things got so risky, though, that Cranmer actually sends his wife and his children to the continent in secret so that they might be safe. Thomas Cromwell would be executed, something which Henry would say he later regretted more than anything else in his life. But he would be executed in 1540, and Cranmer would be left alone without a public face to champion the Reformation in England. He simply had to trust in his Lord to move the king's heart, protect his life, and that his loving and gentle nature would ensure his survival amidst the ravenous wolves. English translations of the Bible would be restricted even more, and many reformers were imprisoned up and down the land. Cranmer himself was investigated without his knowledge. But Cranmer was beloved by Henry, his closest confidant and friend, and he had the king's support. The king even gave to Thomas Cranmer his personal ring of power. So when Cranmer was arrested in 1543, that ring on his finger prevented the Privy Council from taking things any further. In a sense, he outranked them because of what he had upon his hand. And with this, the tides begin to turn against the Conservatives after their failure to get rid of Cranmer. And in 1544, he produces the first bits of the liturgy in English, which people in the pew could understand. Now, as King Henry lay dying in 1547, Cranmer refuses to give the Roman Catholic last rites, one of the 7 sacraments, but instead simply asked Henry if he believed that Christ in all his mercy would forgive and save him. Henry allegedly squeezed Cranmer's hand in response to that question and died shortly afterwards. As a sign of mourning, Cranmer never shaved his beard again, ultimately getting the most epic beard of the entire Reformation. But of course, a beard was not just a sign of mourning, because on the continent, reformers like Calvin and Bullinger wore beards to demonstrate their rejection of the authority of the Pope, who forbade by law priests from having beards. With Henry, the faith he had at the end of his life is questionable. His final wife was Catherine Parr, who he married in 1543, and she was an avid reformer and frequently argued with her royal husband about the faith. The year before they married, on the advice of Cromwell, he had dismantled the shrines to saints and ancient people of the faith and all their relics, and he'd closed the monasteries which were symbols of the way of Rome with all their worship of ancestors and the like. He closed all the pilgrimage centres up and down the land. And yet doing that also gave him a lot of money which he needed. Was it a sign of his faith or just a sign of his greed and need? He certainly still seems to have believed in transubstantiation, but it seems possible that by the end of his life, on matters of faith alone, the central thing of the Reformation, he had shifted to a more Protestant position. Had the king's eyes been opened as Tyndale prayed? Perhaps half opened. Those of his son, however, would be wide open. With Henry dead, the crown would fall to Edward VI, the 9-year-old boy king. And at last, Cranmer could realise his vision.